So this is what you don't want to see with Flowpoint, a great big lump that goes off in a few seconds. Yeah, so what we're going to do now is use Flowpoint to point up this paved area. So these are a little bit like a porcelain or a slatey kind of finish. So what we've done is we've damped down the area, so it's just got a very thin covering. We can do it with a sponge, nothing more than that. You don't want the holes full of water, but just enough to sort of get the whole area damp. And anywhere where you don't want the Flowpoint to stick, it just wants to be damp. Okay, and you've got to try and keep it damp throughout the process. What we've done is just use a little bit of gaffer tape, just taped up the edges. So we dried off the edges, just using the leaf blower, and we just taped them up, just so that then the Flowpoint won't just run straight onto the next slab. Okay, and then the area around is quite moist anyway, so it has been a little bit wetty this morning, so that's a bit wet. So what we're going to do now, mix up the Flowpoint, get it on, and then get that all spread and worked into the joints, so the joints are nice and full. And then after that, we'll just hose it off. We've also got the pressure washer just in case any areas are sticking a bit as well. So we'll get the Flowpoint on.
So some key things about Flowpoint are that so normally you would mix 4.25 litres of water to a 25 kilogram bag. You want quite a powerful mixer, so you can't just use one that just plugs into an ordinary handheld drill or something like that. You just want a more powerful mixer, a power mixer. Really mix it up really well. You want to be mixing for about 3 to 5 minutes. Once you've done that, you really got to make sure you're organized and that you can sort of get on and get the material applied as quickly as you can, really, especially on a warm day. You've got to move quickly. You can't afford any hold-ups, otherwise it will set on you before you've got a chance to use it. All the surfaces have got to be moist, but not flooded that it's going to dilute the mix.
So what we're doing, we're working the Flowpoint in, just tipped it over the surface. And you can see I'm just looking now for anywhere where the joints aren't quite full, beginning to dry out already. So waiting for it to sort of just now take a fingerprint. We'll have to damp some of these areas down again where they're just getting a bit dry. So there's a couple of ways. This sort of float is great, and these are quite, you can get one of these for about £15 or £12, and they are absolutely vital when you're doing this. So the Flowpoint is just beginning to dry out a bit now. So what we're going to do is just pull that off. I'm just going to test to see in a minute or two whether the Flowpoint is ready. Looking for it to take like a thumbnail, and then when you've got to that, you're ready for the next bit. In the meantime, we can keep this area a bit moister, and then just keep fetching it off. And eventually, at the end, we'll be using sponges just to get off the last bits. So this little bit of just work it back and forth, or you might have a float you can work it in with back and forth both ways to fill the joint, or you might have one of these, a little kind of back and forth, just working it in, making sure the joint is nice and full. So that's the sort of, we've got to that stage, just double checking everywhere we've got all the areas, then we can start. This surplus then can come right off, and we can put that out the way, and then we can start to wash down. You can see the Flowpoint beginning to dry out now, so I'm going to pull this off, pull all that together, get that off, get a bit of little bit of moisture on, and we'll start to work that off. So we'll just collect that up, and then that'll be fine. So what we're doing is we're just making sure we keep all the areas nice and moist. This is not the final kind of watering. There's one or two little tiny, if you've got a little hole like that, you can get a little bit afterwards, or if you've got a little bit of decent stuff, you can brush it in. But what we're doing is just keeping it all moist, and I'm just beginning, to take off the worst, so that we haven't got as much work to do. See, like areas like that, I'll have to just wet that down, make sure that doesn't stick. So if you allow it to dry out, it's going to stick. So you have got to keep it, just misting it a little bit with the hose is perfect. And then you're just dragging off. You've got to find your point where you're going to drag off to. I'm dragging off to an area here because we're going to be putting nice topsoil in and taking it all out. So I'm dragging it off, and I don't want to go to areas where there's paving below of a different kind that could stain. So this is nearly now getting the first sort of take. So anywhere where you're worried, where you might think it's sticking, just get a bit more there. It's quite a big blob there, so I've got to get a bit more water on that, get that off now while I can. Same, there's a blob there, you can see it's already starting to stick a bit there. So get those areas off, and I'll just drag this off and get a bit more water on them so we can drag it off. So we've done nearly done our initial kind of cleaning up. So it's important that you can see it's drying out really quickly. Again, what we've got to do now is get the hose on, get it wet again, and you just keep going, and then with the sponges, we'll get the sponge on and get it to a decent finish. So what we'll do, we'll wet these where the blobs are, get them cleaned off, and then wet the area, have a really good clean up, get the sponges on and really clean it up to give a good finish. So the Flowpoint now, if I put my fingernail into it, it's absolutely, you can see it's, you know, it's hard to get that fingernail in. It's nice and really solid. And what you can do at this stage just is, obviously you want to go over it with a sponge if you can, and if you've got any areas like this where it's just bled into the, just bled a little bit into the ribbon bits of this slate, you can just work on that and clean it up, but you've got to do it obviously quite soon, otherwise once it's fully gone you're going to have a job. You're going to have to, well, you're leaving the school with a power washer, to be honest. So I'm just cleaning up where it's just bled into the sides there, but we're just about ready now for a final kind of pass. Just got one there, see there, I could just clean that down, so we've got a nice joint, nice full joint. So now what we'll do is we'll just really jet it off with just using an ordinary hose and water, but if you did have a problem and that didn't work, then you're into obviously using your power washer, and then that should then all be nice and all nice and set. So we're at the last stage, and all we do is work from one corner and wash off, and you should be able to do it with an ordinary hose with you know, just ordinary sort of normal power. But if you did have really stubborn bits, that's when you'd use your power washer. But you can see here we're pretty much one or two little tiny bits, but on the whole it's pretty much there. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to, you know, just keep doing that until you're happy, but I wouldn't overdo it because you're going to drag a little bit of what you've already jointed with if you do too much of that. So may as well let it all set now. It's all, you know, you will get a little bit of sandy residue in places, but once you've left a day or two, you can always give it another blast, and then that will make it really clean. So what we're doing today is getting the Flowpoint on. We've mixed it up. You can use 4.2 litres to a bag. We found just a little bit more water really is important because it's just a little bit dry, and you get a dry day, it'll set like anything, so the cooler the day the better. So what you've got to do is wet everything down first, and then once you've wetted your paving, make sure it's not flooded. You don't want it flooded. You can actually go over it with a sponge, or you can just wet it with just a rose, and then with the joints we just work it two ways, back and forth, just like you would if you were tiling. If you're a bit of a damp day, you can actually use something a little thicker, so you have your Flowpoint just a little bit thicker, and it will hold just a bit more like tile grout. So where here I'd normally tape that up, but because the Flowpoint is gone off a little bit, you can use that to do these edgings, and then with a bit of water in a minute. That'll clean up, and just work it in both ways. Keep working it, work from outside in, across if you can, and then in a little while this will clean up and that will be done. So a couple of little things you can do with Flowpoint. I say that all this will get power washed, but you've got to keep it damp just to stop it sticking. But it, as I say, it can go off really quickly. I'll show you a piece that went off within about 5 minutes on a hot day. Hot summer's day. You don't want that on a hot summer's night. You do not want that. But it's all cleaned up. There's a few plants put ready there. There's a Formium, Euchera, Tetrapanax, Cistus and Teucrium, and a bit of rosemary ready to go, and we're just about done.